Political policy as summer reading. I'm Brian Lilley for TheRebel.Media. You may notice I'm at a lake. I'm kind of on vacation, except I'm still thinking about the election. I'm still talking to you about the election. I'm still talking to you about the policies that are out there, which is more than some media outlets, more than some journalists are doing. They're focused almost exclusively on the Duffy trial. Even Justin Lane over at Vice was pointing this out on Twitter, the non-stop asking of questions about the Duffy trial. It's not really revealing anything more. It's not getting Prime Minister Harper to say anything, and yet they keep doing it. Even on the newscast, I was watching the other day, I decided to torture myself and watch CBC and CTV, and at one point they made a mention that Stephen Harper had something for making home ownership more affordable, that Mulcair was making an announcement about tourism. They didn't give you any details, but then they said about how they both wanted to respond to the Duffy trial. That's the full extent of the election coverage. And as long as the Duffy trial's going on, that's what it's going to be like. Or you'll get small little stories. I'm waiting for a story that deals with the fact that Stephen Harper's Instagram account is all of a sudden no longer bilingual. I mean, for a while, when it was before the election call, the Prime Minister's Instagram account, where he posts pictures of himself at various events, it was in both languages pretty much all the time. And now that it's in campaign mode, it's not. I don't know who's running it now versus who was running it then, but mark my words, there will be a story on this. They won't focus quite so much on Tom Mulcair's Instagram account, which is bilingual if he's in English Canada, and if he's in Quebec, at least outside of Montreal, it's in French only. Trudeau, by the way, is bilingual pretty much all the time. We'll get that kind of story, but they're not going to look at actual bilingualism policies of the various parties. Told you about the NDP policy book a little while ago. Well, I want to dive deeper into that, because the NDP is promising that, well, pretty much close to recognizing Quebec as a distinct society if they form government. It's right there in their policy book that their version of asymmetrical federalism includes recognizing Quebec's distinct characteristic, including that French is the language of work. All right. How would that actually change anything for people outside of Quebec? Well, the NDP is on the record as supporting, in fact, it was one of their bills originally, they're on the record as supporting the idea that every Supreme Court justice that appointed from across Canada has to be fully bilingual. They voted for a bill that said you've got to be fully bilingual and hear cases without the use of simultaneous translation or translation services. That sounds simple if you think bilingualism is simple, but the Supreme Court hears cases on taxation, on criminal law, on immigration cases. All of these things have their own way of phrasing things. They have their own jargon, if you will. And the jargon will differ between English and French. Our Supreme Court has been functioning for, more than 100 years without this sort of thing. They've been doing very well with translation services. They've been doing very well in hearing cases with simultaneous translation. But the NDP doesn't think that's good enough. They want to play the language card. Even though, and I say this as I stand at a lake in Quebec, that they would be alienating an awful lot of good Quebec lawyers, as well as English-speaking lawyers from the rest of the country. See, the level of bilingualism needed for me to go across the lake into town and buy a case of beer or do some groceries is very limited. And I can do that. And the people in the store, they don't speak much English, but we always get along and we figure out what we need. They need money, I need stuff. It's a good transaction. We banter back and forth in each other's languages to the best of our abilities. Hearing a Supreme Court case is something very different. And few people outside of the Ottawa-Montreal corridor are going to be able to practice the other language, whether it's French or English, to a sufficient degree to be able to hear all those different types of cases. Now, I've pointed this out before, but I think it bears repeating in the middle of an election campaign. Beverly McLaughlin was not sufficiently bilingual when she was appointed. She's the Supreme Court Justice now, or the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but when she was appointed back in the late 80s, she was not bilingual enough. She came from Alberta. Russ Brown, probably not bilingual enough. But also Marie Deschamps, when she was appointed to the Supreme Court, I've been told that her English was not good enough that she would have been able to hear all these cases without the aid, at times, of translation or translators. The translation is the written service, and then the translators is the oral when arguments are being heard. The NDP and the Liberals, who have also voted for this policy, are just looking to score language points with those people that already hate the Conservatives and think that they're against bilingualism. It doesn't matter that it was Diefenbaker that allowed French bureaucrats in Ottawa to get their paychecks and pay stubs delivered to them in French. It doesn't matter that it was Diefenbaker that brought in simultaneous translation. If you're not willing to genuflect constantly and expand these programs, well, then you are against French. You're against bilingualism. And I know in some parts of the country that plays well. It does. But let me tell you, as someone that lives in Ottawa, that visits Quebec often, that has traveled to Northern Ontario, there is a French factor. But they're not necessarily pushing for this either. And they understand that this level of bilingualism would alienate enough of them. The fact is, our Supreme Court works just fine as it is. This push by the NDP and the Liberals, that's the type of bilingualism policy we should be talking about. Unfortunately, as I said, though, we'll get a story about Instagram accounts before the mainstream media ever look at real policy.